My name is Dava Sobel. I'm a science writer, and although I'm in my late 70s, I have only fairly recently come to the topic of women in science. And this happened in connection with my book before the new one, a book called The Glass Universe, which is about a group of women astronomers at Harvard. And I chose the topic because it was so interesting to think of a group of women astronomers at Harvard, of all places, especially in the late 1800s and early 1900s, when Harvard was infamously unfriendly to women. But it turned out that the observatory was a wholly separate entity, and women were extremely welcome there and given tremendous independence, responsibility, and even authority. But in doing the research and telling the story, much to my chagrin, I found myself constantly surprised by what they had done. And after a while, I had to admit that even though I am a woman and I write about science and have done that for 50 some years, I somehow had this negative attitude about women and didn't really expect much from them, which was a mortifying self-discovery. And then I think even more distressing was discovering how widespread that attitude was among well-educated women. So that gave me a whole new perspective on things, on science, on myself, and I really wanted to tell stories about women scientists. And my editor immediately suggested a new biography of Madame Curie. And I thought, no, I don't want to do that. She's too famous. Everybody knows who she is. She's this iconic figure because she won 2 Nobel Prizes. So she was the first woman ever to win any Nobel Prize in any category. And then to this day, she remains the only person who's ever won in both physics and chemistry. But then I was reading another book about women chemists, a book I was asked to review. It was called Women in Their Element, and it was a collection of 30-some profiles of female chemists. And of course, Madame Curie was one of the women, and her daughter Irene was another. But then there were 5 or 6 other women in this book who mentioned some formative period in Madame Curie's lab. And that really surprised me. And I got in touch with the Curie Museum in Paris, where there were records of everyone who had worked in the lab. And about 45 women had passed through her laboratory. And it was her laboratory from 1906, when her husband died, till 1934, when she died. And I realized, well, of course, women all over the world knew who she was. She was world famous because of the Nobel Prizes. And then she was also the only woman in the world who had charge of a laboratory and was a professor at a major university. So the young women scientists must have flocked to her, and she didn't have to go looking for them. She just had to not say no. And men came to her too. She took in and trained many more men than women. But the women's story is what interested me. And that's why the book is called The Elements of Marie Curie, How the Glow of Radium lit a path for women in science. And Marie Curie is heroic and admirable for many things that are not as well known as her discoveries of radium and polonium. Perhaps the thing that stunned me the most was her work during the First World War, when she outfitted a van with X-ray equipment and went off to mobile field hospitals, to the front lines, with her 17-year-old daughter, and devoted her time to X-raying wounded soldiers and convincing doctors of the value of X-ray diagnosis. And then she also, during the war, ran a course for French women to become X-ray technicians. And in a 6-week crash course that she taught, she trained 150 women to join that effort. And of course, they then had great jobs and could continue as X-ray technicians in peacetime. So her life story provides a frame for the stories of these other 45 women, some of whom left hardly a trace in the lab, and there's very little one can say about them. But as a whole, they tell a pretty remarkable story.